These days, it seems like Hollywood is churning out more remakes, revivals, and reimaginings than ever before. Truth is, though, it's been happening for decades, and there are some movies you might never have known were actually remakes. It's hard to imagine anyone replicating the energy and dynamism of Jean-Claude Van Damme, but Michael Jai White held his own in the 2020 remake of Sudden Death, titled Welcome to Sudden Death. Van Damme starred as a hockey stadium security guard in the original 1995 action flick from director Peter Hyams, in which he fights to save the entire crowd and his two daughters from being blown to smithereens. The movie's $35 million production budget pulled in a dismal $65 million worldwide, and the film completely divided critics. But to this day, it still has its advocates. Director and screenwriter Dallas Jackson pulled many of those same story threads in the updated version, and while it doesn't have the best Rotten Tomatoes score in the world, it did break into the top 10 on Netflix when it dropped in 2020. As one critic pointed out, Welcome is a flick that greatly benefits from its winking self-awareness and from White's winning performance. Is there a movie mobster more iconic than Al Pacino's Tony Montana?
Say hello to my little friend!
There are a few gangster movies that hold up to Brian De Palma's 1983 hit. Not only does it hold a 93% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but it pulled in an 8.9 score with users on Metacritic too. It also killed at the box office and put a then 25-year-old Michelle Pfeiffer on the map. So some may be surprised to hear that the movie wasn't the first of its kind. Back in 1932, Scarface first debuted with Paul Muni in the leading role of Tony Camonte, an immigrant who turns to the gangster lifestyle in Chicago. That flick was based on the 1930 novel of the same name by Artemis Trail, who based his story on the life of the notorious gangster Al Capone. This tale of an outsider working his way up the criminal ladder is clearly as timeless as it is thrilling. And if you haven't caught the original, it's worth a side-by-side watch just to catch the similarities, despite the changes in both character and location. In 2012, after the Harry Potter films had wrapped for good, Daniel Radcliffe set out to prove that he was more than just the boy who lived, beginning with an adaptation of Susan Hill's 1983 novel The Woman in Black. Certainly, this gothic horror film was about as far as you could get from the wizarding world of Harry Potter and his pals. However, Radcliffe and director James Watkins weren't the first to tackle this particular tale. In 1989, British filmmakers attempted a straight-to-TV adaptation of the novel, one that was nominated for 4 below-the-line BAFTA awards that year. Watkins' adaptation didn't hit the same notes with critics, but it did rake in nearly $130 million in the global box office against a budget of $15 million. The film was successful enough to earn a sequel, The Woman in Black: Angel of Death, in 2015. However, neither Radcliffe nor Watkins were involved, and the movie bombed, both with critics and at the box office. Stunt casting and fancy visual effects don't always do a horror thriller much good, especially when you're talking about a remake of a movie that was already considered pretty great. Enter Nicolas Cage, who in 2006 took the lead role in Neil LaBute's The Wicker Man.
Not the beast! Not the beast! Ah! Open my eyes! Eyes!
When it first debuted, not everyone realized that the movie was an updated version of the 1973 offering starring Edward Woodward and directed by Robin Hardy. In horror circles, however, that film has been beloved for decades for its unsettling tone, its memorable performances, and its truly horrific ending. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Cage's adaptation. Audiences and critics alike panned the movie at the time of its release thanks to its unintentionally hilarious nature and its near-total failure to tackle its scarier side in a cohesive manner. In other words, if you're looking for a creepy thrill and aren't familiar with either film, you're better off sticking with the original. In 1999, Geoffrey Rush led an all-star cast in a remake of William Castle's 1959 horror movie House on Haunted Hill. The 1999 version of the story was the first project for Dark Castle Entertainment, a production label that originally intended to remake all of Castle's legendary films. Like many horror movie updates, the more recent iteration injected its scares with more impressive technology and special effects under new director William Malone. But that wasn't the only difference between the movies. Both films begin with the same classic premise. A group of strangers are told they'll earn a large sum of cash if they can survive the night in a haunted location. But while the original film takes place in a haunted house, the remake uses a long-abandoned asylum as the backdrop. From there, the story is a winding tale of deceit, betrayal, supernatural forces, and other creepy occurrences. The biggest difference of all, however, is that while almost everything that happens can be logically explained in the original version, the ghosts are very much real in the newer one. And as for Dark Castle Entertainment, the studio went on to remake another Castle classic, 13 Ghosts, before expanding its vision and tackling a number of original films, such as 2009's Orphan. Think of Canadian director David Cronenberg and you'll inevitably conjure up images of Jeff Goldblum as a half-man, half-insect from the 1986 body horror film The Fly. However, that particular box office hit wasn't the first big screen offering based on George Langland's 1957 short story. In 1958, director Kurt Newman put his spin on the tale of a scientist whose life is irrevocably changed after testing out his teleportation device. Al Hedison, Patricia Owens, and horror legend Vincent Price all starred in a movie so successful that it spawned two sequels, 1959's Return of the Fly and 1965's Curse of the Fly. Sadly, those films had been largely forgotten by the time Cronenberg put his stamp on the story, with the latter-day version still considered the director's greatest film. That movie also launched a sequel, The Fly 2, which was directed by makeup effects artist Chris Walas, who had taken home an Oscar for his work on the original. In 1987, emerging star Kevin Costner was having quite the year, what with his starring role alongside Sean Connery in the classic gangster movie The Untouchables. But that wasn't Costner's only movie to be released in '87. He also starred as Tom Farrell in the politically charged thriller No Way Out. In the latter movie, Costner's character is a Navy lieutenant who investigates the death of a woman with whom he was romantically involved. But when the scandalous circumstances surrounding her death are revealed, they set off a string of high-stakes calamities. The movie was quite the hit with critics at the time of its debut, but this wasn't the first time Kenneth Beering's 1946 novel The Big Clock had been translated to the big screen. In 1948, John Farrell directed a film also called The Big Clock. Then, in 1976, French director Alain Corneau took a stab at the story with Police Python 357. While all three films differ in terms of exact plot details, all three successfully capture the neo-noir vibe of the original story. The Coen brothers had long established themselves as some of Hollywood's most influential filmmakers when they decided to remake True Grit in 2010. And maybe that's why some people didn't notice that the movie was actually a remake of a 1969 cowboy flick starring John Wayne. That said, even the Coen brothers insisted the movie wasn't a remake, claiming that they were basing their own movie directly on the 1968 novel of the same name by Charles Portis. But they weren't fooling anybody.
I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man.
I call that bold talk for a one-eyed fat man.
The original True Grit was the movie that landed Wayne his only Oscar win, and while Jeff Bridges put his own spin on the character of Rooster Cogburn, Wayne was clearly a tough act to follow. Still, the updated take did put Haley Steinfeld on the map thanks to her breakout role as vengeful teen Maddie Ross. And while the movie didn't take home any Oscar wins, it was nominated for 10 awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Actor and Actress for Bridges and Steinfeld, respectively. If you grew up in the 1990s, you probably have vivid memories of Alfonso Cuarón's A Little Princess. The movie revolves around a little girl named Sarah Crew, whose adoring father leaves her at a boarding school to serve in the war. When her father goes missing and is presumed dead, Sarah winds up as one of the school's servants under the cruel Miss Minchin. This tragic tale is based on a 1905 book of the same name by Frances Hodgson Burnett, so it may not surprise you to learn that the 1995 movie wasn't the first big screen adaptation of the story. Another Little Princess had hit theaters in 1939 and starred the famous child actor Shirley Temple in the role of Sarah, and was equally beloved in its time. In fact, to this day, it's still considered one of Temple's greatest movies. In 2017, Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston starred in the funny but heartfelt dramedy The Upside, in which a wealthy paraplegic hires a man with a criminal record named Dell to help him out. Right away, the movie ran into problems, with the Weinstein Company selling the film off in the wake of the lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein, and Hart being hired and then fired from hosting the Oscars. Still, the upside to The Upside was that it fared well with audiences when it finally opened in theaters in 2019, pulling in just over $125 million at the global box office. What many moviegoers didn't realize, however, was that the film is actually a remake of the 2011 French film The Untouchables. While both share a similar premise, there are a few key differences, including the setting, a new love interest in the American version, and the inclusion of a son for the character of Dell. To celebrate Valentine's Day in 2014, director Shauna Festi unleashed young love on moviegoers everywhere with an adaptation of Scott Spencer's 1979 novel Endless Love. The movie starred Gabriella Wilde and Alex Pettyfer as Jade and David, two pretty young things who fall in love, much to the chagrin of Jade's father. The film was clearly targeted at a younger generation, being co-written by former Gossip Girl scribe Joshua Safran and produced by the show's executive producer Josh Schwartz. So it'd be more than understandable if you didn't catch that the movie is technically a remake of a 1981 film starring Brooke Shields and Martin Hewitt. That film was also based on Spencer's novel, but its plot turns were much different than the newer version. Still, the 1981 movie deserves a place in the pop culture vault. It isn't exactly beloved by movie fans, but it does at least feature the film debut of a guy called Tom Cruise. It also helped to popularize the Endless Love collaboration between Diana Ross and Lionel Richie, a prom anthem that topped the charts on its release that same year. There was no shortage of star power in the 2006 ocean survival thriller Poseidon, a movie shot under a whopping $160 million budget. Unfortunately, the movie pulled in just $180 million at the box office, and after the costs of promotion and distribution were factored in, it ended up losing money for the studio. Director Wolfgang Petersen later revealed he regretted ever taking on the project. It was a different story in 1972, however, when director Ronald Neame helmed the first on-screen iteration of Paul Gallico's 1969 novel The Poseidon Adventure. The original movie starred Gene Hackman and Shelley Winters and earned 9 Oscar nominations, including wins for Best Original Song and Visual Effects. That version also fared well with critics and viewers, who practically doubled the lousy Rotten Tomatoes scores of the remake. Just because you change the name of a film doesn't make it any less of a remake. At least that's the case with Oliver Hirschbiegel's 2007 film The Invasion, which is the 4th film adaptation of The Body Snatchers, a 1955 novel by Jack Finney. There's no denying the project was buzzworthy in its own right, however, what with Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig in the leading roles. The movie follows a psychiatrist as she figures out aliens are planning, you guessed it, an invasion, with her son being the only person who can stop them. It's a female-led, updated take on the 1956 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, as well as the 1978 Philip Kaufman release of the same name. And of course, those are separate projects from the 1993 offering Body Snatchers, in which a teenager and her dad try to stop an invasion stemming from a nearby military base. Of all the iterations, it's still the first 2 films that critics and viewers respond to the best, so if you find yourself deciding between all 4, you may want to lean towards the early years. Who needs humans when you've got talking pets? In 1993, Disney brought in Michael J. Fox, Don Ameche, and Sally Field to voice the 2 dogs and a cat at the heart of Homeward Bound: The Incredible Journey, in which the animals traverse the Sierra Nevada mountains to return home. Families turned out in droves to the movie, which was a box office hit, pulling in more than $40 million worldwide. It was even enough to prompt a San Francisco-based sequel 3 years later, with Field and Fox reprising their original roles. That's not too shabby, especially considering the movie was actually an updated version of the Mouse House's 1963 film The Incredible Journey. Of course, in the original film, the animals don't talk, which definitely makes things at least a little different. It's also worth pointing out that both are based on a book of the same name, written by Scottish author Sheila Burnford. It's hard not to be blinded by the sheer star power that drove Ocean's 11 to a box office win when it first debuted in 2001. Director Steven Soderbergh recruited a veritable who's who of household names and Hollywood stars to pull off the heist drama, which was filled with all kinds of twists and turns against this Las Vegas casino setting.
You're a thief and a liar.
I only lied about being a thief. I don't do that anymore.
Steal.
Lie.
But it's no wonder the movie attracted such high-caliber talent, as it was based on an original 1960s Rat Pack film of the same name. It later came out that the new cast members weren't exactly fans of the original film, although $450 million worth of global moviegoers would probably agree that the new class had earned themselves the right to their opinion. That same cast later reunited for 2004's Ocean's 12 and 2007's Ocean's 13. Years before Tony Goldwyn made a name for himself on the political thriller Scandal, he played a father out for justice in the 2009 revenge horror flick The Last House on the Left. This is a movie that asked how far a scorned family would go to avenge their daughter, who was attacked by a gang of miscreants. Director Dennis Iliadis didn't have to go too far for inspiration, though. The Last House on the Left was actually a remake of horror master Wes Craven's 1972 film of the same name, which also happened to be the director's debut. That movie was made on a shoestring budget of just $87,000, but pulled in more than $3 million at the box office. The project has been applauded for being an anti-establishment shocker and the first of its kind. So in spite of the remake's notable cast, bigger budget, and Craven's return to produce, it wasn't quite as well received as the original. Adam Sandler fans are a pretty loyal bunch, which probably explains why 2002's Mr. Deeds snagged a 59% audience approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, compared to the 21% critics score. And sure, it's one of the lesser-loved Sandler projects out there, but the movie does have its defenders. Maybe that comes down to the fact that it's actually a remake of the 1936 romantic dramedy Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. That film, which in turn is based on the 1935 short story Opera Hat, starred Gary Cooper and Jean Arthur in the leading roles. And although Sandler's remake was a box office success, it's clear that critics much preferred the original, with the former's Rotten Tomatoes consensus reading, "This update of Capra doesn't hold a candle to the original, and even on its own merits, Mr. Deeds is still indifferently acted and stale." The Coen brothers already had a successful string of movies under their belt by 2004, including instant classics like Fargo and The Big Lebowski. But they were also coming off the glossier Universal Pictures rom-com Intolerable Cruelty, which to this day is considered one of their worst films. So it was something of a gamble when they opted to remake the beloved 1955 British movie The Ladykillers. In fact, the Coens and star Tom Hanks were well aware that Brit viewers were going to crucify them for doing it. Yet they went about this comedy of errors in their own way, updating the characters and setting for an American audience that wasn't so aware of the original movie. In the 2004 film, Hanks stars as a professor who charms his way into renting a room from an unassuming older lady, and then uses her home as a hideout from which he can plan to rob a casino. As it turned out, The Ladykillers was another hugely divisive film that managed to do at least one positive thing for the filmmakers. It finally changed some critics' minds about which Coen brothers movie is the worst. Longtime Western fans will fondly remember Clint Eastwood's starring turn in Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars, which hit theaters back in 1964 and was the star's first major big-screen role. This story of a gunfighter who pits two feuding families against each other was so well received that it spawned two follow-ups as part of the so-called Dollars trilogy, For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. But the original film wasn't so original after all. It was actually an unofficial and unlicensed remake of a 1961 Japanese samurai film called Yojimbo. When filmmaker Akira Kurosawa found out about A Fistful of Dollars, he sued Leone, and the pair eventually settled out of court. However, despite the drama, both films are incredibly influential flicks, and when comparing Eastwood's Gunslinger to Toshiro Mifune's Samurai, it's genuinely difficult to decide who's cooler. Jay Roach's Meet the Parents turned out to be a smash hit when it landed in theaters in 2000. The story of Greg Fokker meeting his girlfriend's parents was a massive box office success and even spawned two sequels, Meet the Fockers and Little Fockers. What most fans might not realize, however, is that the film is actually a remake of a 1992 movie also called Meet the Parents, which was co-written, directed, and starred Greg Gliena. After the film's release, Universal Pictures acquired the right to adapt this darkly comic story of a man coming home to meet his partner's parents. New writers Jim Hertzfield and John Hamburg took out some of the original film's more morbid elements in the remake, with the result being a decent enough comedy that made a ton of money, and was even nominated for a handful of awards. Richard Gere, Diane Lane, and Oliver Martinez had viewers everywhere saying ooh la la after seeing Unfaithful, the 2002 movie about a woman whose life unravels in the wake of an unexpected affair. Director Adrian Lyne's hot take on the movie had everything from tingling love scenes to murderous intrigue, and it earned Lane heaps of critical praise for her performance, as well as nominations at both the Golden Globes and Oscars. The leading lady's performance aside, critics were a little more mixed about the movie itself, but it performed well at the box office and transformed a $50 million budget into nearly $120 million worldwide. But as it turns out, Unfaithful was faithful to another film, the 1969 French movie The Unfaithful Wife. While that title may be a little more on the nose than the remake, critics seem to enjoy the film itself, which earned far more positive reviews than the newer version. Brad Pitt may be an illustrious A-lister, but even the Oscar-winning actor has had his share of bombs. For example, take Martin Brest's Meet Joe Black, co-starring Anthony Hopkins and Claire Forlani. The 3-hour film follows Death, who comes to Earth and inhabits a man's body to learn the ways of humans. He enlists a media mogul to guide him along the way, but things get complicated when Death falls for his guide's daughter. The movie didn't even double its $90 million budget, only earning just under $143 million worldwide. That could explain why the clip of Pitt's character getting hit by a car went viral in 2019, as new fans discovered one of the movie's most unintentionally hilarious scenes. It's safe to say that the original film on which Meet Joe Black is based fared better, at least from a critical standpoint. The 1934 flick Death Takes a Holiday offers a similar premise and story, starring Frederick March as Death, who inhabits a body in order to better understand humanity. The difference is that this movie received generally positive reviews from audiences and critics alike. In 2003, Mark Wahlberg and Charlize Theron teamed up for The Italian Job, an adrenaline-packed heist film from F. Gary Gray featuring an all-star cast and a whole lot of car chases. The movie earned fairly positive reviews from critics and a lot of love from audiences, with a whopping return of $176 million at the worldwide box office against the $60 million production budget. But this team of international gold seekers wasn't the first to connect with audiences. In 1969, Michael Caine headed up the cast of the original British movie The Italian Job, under the guidance of director Peter Collinson. When it came to critical and audience acclaim, that film blew the bloody doors off, largely thanks to its hugely impressive car chase, which is considered one of the all-time greats. On top of that, The Italian Job helped cement Caine as an icon of the British film scene, and both he and the movie have since gone down in movie history.
Hang on a minute, lads. I've got a great idea.
Crime capers don't get much better than this. Long before Robert De Niro was biting off faces in Martin Scorsese's 1991 iteration of Cape Fear, it was Robert Mitchum who shocked moviegoers with his own take on the Max Cady character in 1962. Both stories follow a lawyer whose family is terrorized by a man he helped put in jail, and both versions are based on the 1957 novel The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. But while Gregory Peck starred as the lawyer in question in the first film, it was Nick Nolte who took over the main role for the remake. While some were divided over the liberties Scorsese took with his version of the story, the lead performances clearly resonated with Oscar voters, as both De Niro and supporting actress Juliette Lewis received nods at the awards. However, both critics and viewers seem to agree that, as an overall story, it's the original that reigns supreme. On Rotten Tomatoes, the original has a critic score of 96% and audience score of 86%, while the remake falls below that at 75% and 77% respectively. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.